Her only awareness, as she lay sprawled in front of her school locker on the mud streaked floor, was that her elbow was hurting. Really, really hurting. Falling down is always such a shock. It happens so fast. One moment you're upright, moving quickly forward with some deliberate intention of being in your seat when the bell rings, and the next minute you're lying flat on your back, immobilized, stunned, hurt, hurting. And the worst thing in the whole world is to fall down at school where everyone can see you. Sara looked up into a sea of gleeful looking faces that were grinning, snickering, or laughing right out loud. They act like nothing like this has ever happened to them. Once they figured out that there was nothing as exciting as a broken bone or bleeding flesh or a victim writhing in pain, the crowd dissolved. And her ghoulish schoolmates went on with their own lives, making their way back to their classrooms. A blue sweatered arm reached down and the hand took hers, pulling her into a sitting position. And a girl's voice said, "Are you okay? Do you want to stand up?" No, Sara thought. I want to disappear. But since that wasn't likely, and since the crowd had already pretty much dissolved, Sara smiled weakly and Ellen helped her to her feet. Sara had never spoken with Ellen before, but she had always seen her in the hallways. Ellen was 2 grades ahead of Sara, but she had only been at her school for about a year. Is there an issue, Nandini? Okay, but she had only been at her school for about a year. Okay, is the voice breaking up? Okay, great, great. All right. Sara really didn't know much about Ellen, but then that wasn't unusual. Older kids never interacted with younger ones. There was some kind of unwritten code against that. There are some unwritten codes against that. But Ellen always smiled easily, even though she didn't seem to have many friends and moved pretty much by herself and seemed perfectly happy. That must have been why Sara noticed her. Sara was a loner too. She preferred it that way. These floors are so slippery when it's wet outside, Ellen said. I'm surprised more people don't fall here. Still a bit dazed and embarrassed into numbness. Sara wasn't consciously focused on the words Ellen was speaking, but something about Ellen's offering was making Sara feel much better. It was little unsettling to Sara to find herself so affected by another person. How many of you feel that way? You feel unsettled to be affected by someone else. It was truly a rare occasion for her to prefer the words spoken from another to quiet retreat into her private thoughts. This felt weird. Thank you, Sara muttered as she tried to brush some of the mud from her soiled skirt. I don't think it will look so bad once it dries a bit, Ellen said. And again, it wasn't the words that Ellen spoke. They were just normal, everyday words, but it was something else. Something about the way she spoke them. Ellen's calm, clear voice seemed to soothe the sense of tragedy and trauma Sara had been feeling, and her enormous embarrassment all but vanished, leaving Sara feeling stronger and better. Oh, it really doesn't matter, Sara replied. We'd better hurry or we'll be late. As she took her seat, elbow throbbing, clothes muddied, shoelaces untied, and her stringy brown hair hanging in her eyes, she felt better than she had ever felt sitting in the seat. It wasn't logical, but it was true. Sarah's walk home from school was different that day. Instead of withdrawing into her own quiet thoughts, noticing not much more than the narrow path in the snow before her, humming a familiar tune, she moved happily down her path, watching others on their way about the small town. As she passed the town's only restaurant, Sara considered stopping in for an after school snack. Often, a glazed donut or an ice cream cone or a small basket of French fried potatoes was just the thing to temporarily distract Sara from the long, weary day she had spent at school. I still have all of this week's allowance, Sara thought, standing on the sidewalk in front of the small cafe considering, but she decided not to as she remembered her mother's often uttered words. Don't spoil your dinner. Sara had never understood those words because she was always ready to eat if what was offered was good. Isn't it? Me too. Yeah. It was only when dinner didn't look good, or more important, when it didn't smell good, or more, that she found excuses to pass it by, or at least eat it sparingly. That's all of us, isn't it? Seems to me like somebody else is the one that spoils it. Sara grinned to herself as she continued walking home. She really didn't need anything today anyway. For today, all was really rather well in Sara's world. All is well in my world. This is one of the affirmations we use to create a beautiful life. Chapter 4. Sara stopped atop the Main Street bridge, looking below at the ice to see if it looked thick enough to walk across. Some rather large dog tracks in the snow on the ice, but she didn't think that the ice was quite ready for all of her weight, including a heavy coat, boots, and a rather hefty bag of books. Better wait a bit, Sara thought, as she peered down the icy river, leaning way out over the ice, supported by the rusty railing, which Sara believed was there just for her own personal pleasure, and feeling better than she had been in a long time. She decided to stay for a while to look at her wonderful river. She dropped her book bag at the feet and leaned against her metal rusty railing. Sarah's favorite place in the whole world. It's interesting how she calls it her rusty metal railing. Resting and leaning and appreciating the spot, Sarah smiled as she remembered the old day this railing was transformed into the perfect leaning patch by Mr. Jackson's hay truck when he slammed on his brakes on the wet, icy road to avoid running over Harvey, Mrs. Peterson's dachshund. Dachshund. Everyone talked in town talked on and on for months about how lucky he was that his truck didn't go right into the river. Well, that would be very different. Sarah was always surprised at how people were always making things seem bigger and worse than they really were. That's all of us, isn't it? Yeah. If Mr. Jackson's truck, at least sometimes, yeah. If Mr. Jackson's truck had gone into the river, well, that would be very different. That would justify the big fuss everyone made. Or if he had gone into the river and had drowned, that would have been even more reason to talk, but he did go into the river. As far as Sarah could figure out, no harm had come from it at all. His truck wasn't damaged. Mr. Jackson wasn't damaged. Harvey was frightened and stayed home for several days, but he wasn't hurt in any way. People just like to worry, Sarah concluded. But Sarah was elated when she discovered her new leaning perch. Large, heavy gauge steel posts were now bending way out over the water. So perfect, as if it was made especially to please and delight Sarah. Leaning out over the river, looking downstream, Sarah could see the great log stretched across the river, and that made her smile too. That was another accident that suited her just fine. One of the big trees that lined the river bank was so badly damaged in a windstorm. So the farmer who owned the land gathered some volunteers from around town and they trimmed all of the branches of the tree, getting ready to cut it down. Sarah wasn't sure why there was so much excitement about it. It was just one big old tree. Father wouldn't let her get close enough to hear much of what they were saying. But Sarah heard someone say that they were worried that the power lines might be too close. But then the big saws started buzzing again, and Sarah couldn't hear anything. So she stood back at a distance with almost everyone else in town to watch such a big event. Suddenly, the saws were quiet, and Sarah heard someone shout, "Oh no!" Sarah remembered covering her ears and squeezing her eyes closed tight. It felt like her whole town shook when the huge tree fell. But when Sarah opened her eyes, give me a minute. Someone's trying to log in, I guess. But when Sarah opened her eyes, she squealed with delight as she got her first glimpse of her perfect log bridge, connecting the little dirt paths on each side of the river. Convenient place to cross, isn't it? As Sarah basked in her metal nest, hanging right out Over the river, she breathed deeply, wanting to take in that great river smell, like the smell of the mud when it rains, isn't it? It was hypnotic. The fragrances, the constant steady sound of the water. I love this old river, she said, Sarah thought, still gazing at her big log that was crossing the water downstream. Sarah loved to put her hands out for balance and see how quickly she could scoot across the log. She was never frightened, but she always was mindful that the slightest slip could take her tumbling into the river, and Sarah never crossed the log that she didn't hear her mother's cautious, uncomfortable words playing in her mind. Sarah, stay away from that river. You could drown. But Sarah didn't pay much attention to those words, not anymore anyway, because she knew something that her mother didn't. Sarah knew that she couldn't drown. Relaxed and at one with the world. Sarah lay in her perch and remembered what had happened on that very log just 2 summers earlier. It had been late in the afternoon and all of Sarah's chores were done. So she had gone down to the river. She had leaned in her metal perch for a while and then she followed the dirt path down the log. The river, swollen from the runoff from the melting snow, was higher than usual, and the water was actually lapping up over the log. She debated whether it was a good idea to cross over, but then a strange sort of whimsical enthusiasm. She decided to cross a precarious log bridge. As she got near the middle, she paused for a moment and turned sideways on the log with both feet pointing downstream, teetering back and forth only slightly as she regained her balance and courage. And then from out of nowhere came Pittsfield's mangy mutt Fuzzy, bounding across the bridge, happily acknowledging Sara and bumping up against her with sufficient force to topple Sara into the very fast-moving river. Well, this is it, Sara thought. Just as my mother warned, I'm going to drown. But things were moving too fast for Sara to give it much thought. For Sara found herself on an amazing and wonderful ride as she floated rapidly downstream on her back with eyes looking upward, seeing one of the most beautiful views she had ever witnessed. She had walked these river banks hundreds of times, but this was a point of view very different from what she has noticed before. So she could have noticed something else while she was drowning, but she chose to notice the beautiful view. Gently carried on this amazing cushion of water, she could see the blue sky up above, framed by the perfectly shaped trees, denser and sparser, thicker and thinner. So many beautiful shades of green. Sara wasn't aware that the water was extremely cold, but instead she felt as if she were floating on a magic carpet, smoothly and safely. For a moment, it seemed to be getting darker. As Sara floated into the thick grove of trees that lined the riverbank, she could see almost no sky at all. Wow, these trees are beautiful, Sara said right out loud. She had never walked this far downstream. The trees were lush and lovely. Some of their limbs were dipping right down into the river. And then A long, friendly, solid limb seemed to reach right down into the water to give Sara a hand up. Thank you, tree, Sara said, sweetly pulling herself out of the river. That was very nice of you. She stood on the river bank, dazed but exhilarated, and tried to get her bearings. Wow, Sara muttered as she spotted the Petersons' big red barn. She could barely believe her eyes. In what had seemed to Sara like only a minute or two, she had floated for 5 miles through the pastures and the farmland. But Sara didn't mind the long walk home a bit. With delicious enthusiasm for life, Sara walked and skipped her way home. As soon as she got out of them, she put her dirty, wet clothes in the washing machine and hurriedly ran a nice warm bath. No point in giving mother one more thing to worry about, she thought. This won't make her feel safer. Sara lay in the warm water, smiling, all sorts of leaves, dirt, river bugs washed out of her curly brown hair, knowing with certainty that her mother was wrong. Sara knew that she could never drown. All right, one more chapter. Yes, this 20 minutes. Yes. Yes, if you want one more chapter. All right, great, great. I see all three yeses, all four yeses. All right. Sara, wait up. Sara stopped in the center of the intersection and waited as a little brother ran at top speed toward her. Yeah, gotta come, Sara. It's real neat. I'll bet it is, Sara thought, pondering the last several real neat things Jason had sprung on her. There was the barn rat he trapped in his own self-made trap that was really, really was alive the last time I looked, Jason had promised. Twice he'd caught Sara off guard and had tricked her into peering into his school bag only to find some innocent little bird or mouse that had fallen prey to Jason and his grungy little friends, excited and eager to use their new Christmas BB guns. What is it with boys? Sara pondered, waiting as Jason, tired, had now slowed to a walk, seeing that Sara was actually waiting for him. How can they actually take pleasure in hurting poor, defenseless little animals? I'd like to catch them in a trap and see how they like it, Sara thought. I remember when his pranks were less gory and even funny sometimes, but Jason such just seems to get meaner and meaner. Sara stood in the middle of a quiet country road, waiting for her brother to catch up to her. She suppressed a smile as she remembered the clever hoax Jason had carried out by laying his head down on his desk, hiding his shiny rubber vomit, and then looking up with his big brown eyes, exposing his sickening prize when his teacher stood over him. Mrs. Johnson had rushed out of the room to get the janitor to deal with the mess, but when she came back, Jason announced that he had taken care of it, and Mrs. Johnson was so relieved that she didn't even ask any questions. Jason was excused to go home. Sara was stunned at how gullible Mrs. Johnson had been, not even wondering how this vomit, which has appeared fresh and runny, managed to stand in such a neat puddle on a desk with a fairly significant slope. But then Mrs. Johnson hadn't quite had as much experience with Jason as Sara had, she admitted. He had got her more than once in more naive days. But no more. Sara was on to her brother. Sara, Jason shouted and winded and excited. Sara stepped back. Jason, you don't have to yell. I'm only 2 feet away from you. Sorry. Jason gulped as he tried to catch his breath. You gotta come. Solomon's back. Who's Solomon? Sara questioned, regretting her question as soon as it was blurted out. She didn't want to show one bit of interest in whatever Jason was babbling about. Solomon, Solomon, the giant bird on Thacker's trail. I've never heard of a giant bird on Thacker's trail, Sara offered, mustering as much of a sound of boredom as she could on short notice. Jason, I'm not interested in any of your stupid birds. The bird isn't stupid. Sara, it's gigantic. You should see it. Billy said it's bigger than his father's cat. You have to come, please. Jason, a bird cannot be bigger than a cat. Oh, sorry. It's bigger than his father's car. Sara, you have to come, please. Jason, a bird cannot be bigger than a car. Yes, it can. You can ask Billy's dad. He was driving home one day and he said he saw a shadow so big he thought it was an airplane passing over him. It covered his old car, but it wasn't an airplane, Sara. It was Solomon. Sara had to admit that Jason's enthusiasm for Solomon was getting to her a bit. Contagious, isn't it? Enthusiasm. I'll go some other time, Jason. I have to get home. Oh, Sara, please come. Solomon might not be here again. You have to come. Sara, you have to. Jason's persistence was beginning to worry Sara. He wasn't usually intense. Ordinarily, when he felt Sara's strong will kicking in, he'd just give up and lay low and wait for another opportunity to catch her more off guard. He'd learned from much experience that the more he pressed his sister to do something that she didn't want to, the more impossible Sara became. But there was something different here. Jason seemed compelled in a way that Sara had not seen before. And so, to Jason's tremendous surprise and delight, Sara gave in. Oh, all right, Jason. Where's this giant bird? His name is Solomon. How do you know his name? Billy's dad named him. He says he's an owl and owls are wise, so his name should be Solomon. Sara picked up her pace, trying to keep up with Jason. He's really excited about this bird, Sara thought. This is weird. He's in here somewhere. Jason said he lives in here. Sara was often amused at Jason's assumed confidence. When Sara knew that he really didn't know what he was talking about. But more often than not, Sara would play along pretending that she didn't notice. It was easier that way. They looked into the sparsely leafed thicket, now covered with snow. They walked along a badly decaying fence, following a narrow path in the snow, carved out by a lone dog that had apparently run along not long before them. Sara almost never walked this path in the winter. It was out of her way of her usual walk between school and home. This was, however, a place where Sara had spent countless blissful summer hours. Sara walked along, noting all the familiar nooks and crannies, feeling good about revisiting her old path. The best thing about this path, Sara thought, that it is that I had it to myself. No cars passing by, no neighbors. This is a quiet path. I should walk here more often. Solomon, Jason's voice rang out, startling Sara. She hadn't expected him to shout. Jason, don't yell at Solomon. If he's here, he won't be if you keep that up. He's in here, Sara. I told you he lives here. And if he would have left, we would have seen him. He's really big, Sara, really. Sara and Jason walked deeper and deeper into the thicket, ducking under a rusty wire, which was one of the last remnants of the rickety old fence. They walked along slowly, feeling their way carefully, but not certain what might seem buried in this knee deep snow. Jason, I'm getting cold. Just a little more, Sara, please. It was more from her own curiosity than Jason's prodding that Sara agreed. Okay, Jason, 5 more minutes. Sara shrieked as she stepped waist high into an irrigation ditch camouflaged by the snow. The cold, wet snow came right up under Sara's coat and blouse and touched right up against her bare skin. Okay, Jason, that's it. I'm going home. Jason was disappointed that they didn't find Solomon, but Sara's irritation had distracted him from that. There wasn't much that pleased Jason more than his sister's irritation. Jason laughed heartily as Sara shook the cold, wet snow from under her clothing. Oh, you think that's funny, don't you, Jason? You probably made this whole Solomon thing up just to get me wet and mad. Jason laughed as he ran out ahead of Sara. As much as he enjoyed her irritation, he had wisely learned to keep a safe distance. No, Sara, Solomon is real, you'll see. Yeah, right. Sara snapped back at Jason. But for some reason, Sara knew that Jason was right. Okay. Do I continue? One more chapter? Or we continue tomorrow? C for continue, S for stop. Okay, I see no, yes, no, yes. Okay, I see many stops. So we'll stop here and we'll continue tomorrow. All right. Bye-bye. So Manoj, you will see, okay, so let me unmute you for a bit. You can buy this book if you want. It's not mandatory. So this will give you an understanding. As you stay with the book, you'll understand what the law of attraction is. And if you want to learn further, then I also teach it. I'll clarify your doubts as we go along the way. So that's all there is to it. I'll share the details later for those who are interested.